My wife said I was weak for crying after my mom died, so I went silent, healed alone, and she begged me not to leave. I'm a 32-year-old guy, and the night my mom died will never leave me. She had been sick for a while, but when the phone call came, it didn't matter how much I had prepared, nothing could have prepared me for the silence that followed her last breath. She was more than just my mother. She was the person who held me together when everything else was falling apart. I stumbled into the living room, collapsed onto the couch, and I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a kid. My chest shook, my throat burned, and for a moment I didn't care how I looked, but then my wife's voice cut through the room like glass. "You're weak. Be a man." At first, I thought I misheard. Who says something like that at a time like this? I looked up at her, desperate for some trace of compassion, some flicker of understanding, but all I saw was irritation. Her arms crossed, her expression cold. No hand on my shoulder. No attempt to sit beside me. Just judgment, staring me down while I drowned. I froze. My tears didn't stop because the pain went away. They stopped because I felt something break inside me. It was like my grief had been slammed shut, replaced by a heavy, suffocating disbelief. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just mourning my mother. I was beginning to mourn my marriage too. I sat in silence, staring at the floor, my body heavy with a pain I couldn't share. My mom was gone, and the one person who was supposed to hold me up in the storm had just left me to sink, and that was only the beginning. After that night, the silence between us became unbearable. I thought maybe she would wake up the next morning, realize how cruel her words had been, and try to make it right, but nothing changed. She moved through the house like it was any other day, making coffee, scrolling through her phone, humming to herself as if my entire world hadn't just collapsed. I sat at the kitchen table, numb, waiting for her to notice how broken I was, but she didn't look at me, didn't ask how I was holding up, didn't even mention my mom. It was like she had decided my grief was something shameful, something she didn't want to acknowledge. That evening, she cooked dinner like she always did, plating food as if we were living in some normal routine. I couldn't eat. My chest still felt hollow, my eyes raw from crying. She sat across from me, scrolling on her phone between bites, not once glancing up. The silence was so loud it pressed against my ears. I wanted to scream just to see if she'd react, but I stayed quiet because deep down, I already knew the answer. When she finished, she rinsed her plate, said goodnight, and went upstairs to bed. I stayed on the couch, staring at the darkened TV screen, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. My mother was gone, and the woman I had married, the person who was supposed to be my partner, was treating my grief like an inconvenience. I curled up under a blanket, but it didn't bring comfort. The air felt heavy, cold, and sharp with a truth I couldn't ignore. If she couldn't stand with me in my darkest moment, maybe she had never truly stood with me at all. The days that followed weren't just painful, they were eye-opening. With every hour of silence and every cold glance from her, memories began to flood back, and I started piecing together a truth I had ignored for too long. This wasn't the first time she had treated my emotions like they were nothing. It was a pattern one I had normalized because I wanted to believe she loved me. I remembered the time I came home from work completely drained, telling her how my boss had chewed me out unfairly. Instead of support, she rolled her eyes and said, "Don't be so dramatic. Everyone has problems at work." I remembered when my dad cut me off financially during college, and instead of offering comfort, she smirked and said, "Guess you're not as self-made as you thought." Each memory stacked up like bricks on my chest, building a wall of resentment I hadn't dared to acknowledge before. Now, with my mother gone, those words echoed even louder. I couldn't escape the reality that the woman I married didn't just lack empathy, she resented my vulnerability. She saw my struggles as weaknesses to mock, not wounds to heal. One night, I sat in the dark, staring at her sleeping peacefully beside me, and I felt a wave of anger rush through me. How could she rest so easily when I hadn't slept in days? How could she close her eyes while I lay there reliving the last time I saw my mom, wishing I had just one more conversation with her? It wasn't just that she didn't care, it was that she never had. And realizing that hurt almost as much as losing my mom. And the more I thought about it, the colder our home began to feel. In the days after my mom passed, I started noticing a pattern I had ignored for years. My wife's reaction that night hadn't come out of nowhere. It was part of a bigger picture. I had been too blind, or maybe too hopeful, to see. Her dismissal of my grief was cruel, yes, but it wasn't new. It was just the most obvious example of something she had always done, tearing me down when I was at my lowest. I remembered one night, years earlier, when I came home from work, exhausted. My boss had humiliated me in front of my entire team, and I sat at the kitchen table venting, needing just an ounce of comfort. She didn't even look up from her phone before saying, "Don't be so dramatic." Everyone has a bad day. Another time, when my dad cut me off financially during college, I was devastated. Instead of empathy, she smirked and told me, "Guess you're not as self-made as you like to think." Those words had stung back then, but I convinced myself she didn't mean them. Now, with the raw wound of my mother's death, every one of those moments replayed in my head with brutal clarity. I realized she had never been my safe space, never the person who would hold me up when life knocked me down. Instead, she had been the one chipping away at me, piece by piece, disguising cruelty as honesty and indifference as tough love. One night, I sat awake in the dark while she slept peacefully beside me, and it hit me hard. I had built a life with someone who didn't respect my humanity. My grief wasn't just exposing her true nature, it was forcing me to see that she had shown it all along, and the more I thought about it, the colder my home became. The nights grew heavier after that, not because of the weather, but because of the distance between us. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, my chest tight, while she slept soundly beside me, as if nothing in our world had changed. My mother's last breath still echoed in my head, but I had no one to talk to about it. The one person who should have been my comfort, acted like my grief, was nothing more than background noise. Friends texted condolences. "I'm here if you need anything," but I ignored them. How could I explain that it wasn't just losing my mom that was destroying me? How could I tell them that the woman I married had abandoned me in the very moment I needed her most? I didn't have the strength to answer questions I didn't want to admit out loud. I stopped trying to talk to her about it altogether. When she asked what I wanted for dinner, I muttered one-word answers. When she scrolled through her phone in silence, I mirrored it. The walls of our home felt like they were closing in. And I realized I wasn't just grieving my mother, I was grieving the illusion of partnership I thought I had at night. I curled up on the couch instead of our bed. I told her I couldn't sleep, but the truth was I couldn't bear to lie beside someone who treated my pain as weakness. I wrapped myself in blankets, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the suffocating silence that filled every corner of the house. And with each passing night, the loneliness dug deeper, until even my own home didn't feel like mine anymore. One evening, I was heading upstairs when I heard her voice drifting from the bedroom. At first I thought she was talking to herself, but then I realized she was on the phone. I stopped halfway up the stairs, frozen, because something in her tone made my stomach twist. She was laughing. Laughing. The kind of carefree laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I lingered just long enough to hear the words that shattered me more than anything she had ever said to my face. "He's been moping around for days, like some fragile little boy." My chest clenched so tight I could hardly breathe. I leaned against the wall, my hands shaking, the grief I'd been barely holding together, splitting open all over again. It wasn't just that she thought I was weak, she was mocking my grief behind my back. She was turning the death of my mother into some sort of punchline for her sister. For a moment, I wanted to storm in, scream, demand to know how she could possibly think that was okay. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there in silence, listening to her continue the conversation, her voice light, even amused. While mine felt like it was breaking inside my chest, I crept back down the stairs and sat on the couch in the dark, staring at the glow of the streetlight outside. The betrayal burned hotter than the silence ever had. It wasn't just cruelty anymore, it was humiliation. She had taken the most vulnerable, painful part of my life and turned it into gossip. That was the moment something shifted inside me. My grief wasn't just mine, anymore it had become ammunition for her ridicule. And deep down, I knew things would never be the same again. After overhearing that phone call, I completely shut down. Something inside me went numb, like a switch had been flipped. I stopped eating properly, just picking at whatever scraps I could manage. Some days, I didn't eat at all. I barely spoke, my answers reduced to one word, sometimes nothing at all. The silence between us, once suffocating, became my only defense. She didn't notice, not really. Or maybe she noticed and didn't care. If she did acknowledge me, it was only to snap, "You're being dramatic." Whenever I sat staring into space too long, those words cut deeper than she realized. Because the truth was I was barely hanging on. Every corner of the house felt haunted. I'd sit on the couch, staring at the darkened TV, hearing my mom's voice in my head, remembering her laugh, her advice, the way she always made me feel like I was enough. And then I'd glance over at my wife, scrolling on her phone, eyes glued to a glowing screen, and wonder how I ended up so alone. I stopped answering calls from friends. I ignored texts that said, "checking in." I didn't have the energy to explain why I wasn't okay, and I didn't want anyone to know just how far I had fallen. Nights bled into mornings, mornings into nights, and I felt less like a husband, less like a son, and more like a ghost haunting my own life. It was my lowest point, the moment where even breathing felt like a burden. And still, the person who was supposed to love me most of all acted like my grief was an inconvenience, something to roll her eyes at. And sitting there, invisible in my own home, I realized I couldn't fall any further. One night, when the house was quiet and she was already asleep, I found myself rummaging through a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Buried beneath old receipts and papers was a leather-bound journal my mom had given me on my 25th birthday. The cover smelled faintly of her perfume, and just holding it in my hands brought tears to my eyes. She always told me, when you can't say it out loud, write it down. So I did that at first. My handwriting was messy, shaking from anger and exhaustion. I poured everything onto those pages, the rage, the loneliness, the grief I hadn't been allowed to show. I wrote about how her absence felt like a hole in my chest and how my wife's cruelty only deepened it. By the time I stopped, my hand ached, but my chest felt a fraction lighter. The next day, I forced myself outside for the first time in weeks. I walked through the park where my mom used to take me as a kid, where she'd buy me ice cream and tell me stories about her childhood. The crisp air filled my lungs, and for a brief moment, I felt her with me. I realized that healing wasn't going to come from my wife, or from anyone else. It had to come from me. I started small. A walk here, a journal entry there. Sometimes I lit one of my mom's old candles and just sat in silence, imagining her voice telling me I was stronger than I thought. Slowly, I began to stitch myself back together, not because I had support at home, but in spite of the fact that I didn't. And the more I healed, the more I noticed her noticing. Something changed in me after that. I stopped begging for her comfort. I stopped expecting her to care. Instead of pleading for scraps of empathy, I gave her nothing. When she asked how my day was, I shrugged. When she made dinner, I said thanks and left half of it untouched. When she tried to pick small fights, I didn't bite. My silence became my shield, and for the first time in months, I felt a strange kind of control. It didn't take long for her to notice. One night she looked at me across the table, frowning. "Why are you so distant?" she asked, her tone sharp, like I was the one at fault. I met her gaze, but said nothing. The truth was, I didn't owe her an explanation anymore. She had burned that bridge the moment she mocked my grief. At first, she brushed it off, rolling her eyes the way she always did. But over the days that followed, I saw the confusion creeping in. She'd try harder to get my attention, asking about my work, trying to make jokes, even wearing the perfume she knew I liked. But it all felt hollow, and I refused to give her the validation she was suddenly desperate for. The silence that once made me feel invisible now gave me power. I realized I didn't need her approval, didn't need her pity. I had survived my lowest point without her, and that made me stronger than she could ever understand. And the colder I became, the more restless she grew. It was the first time in our marriage that she couldn't dismiss me, and I could see the fear of losing control flicker in her eyes. Weeks passed, and the space between us grew into something we couldn't ignore. The silence wasn't temporary anymore, was a living thing in our home. Stretching across the dinner table, filling the bedroom, lingering in the car rides where neither of us spoke. She tried to bridge it, but not in ways that mattered. One night she made my favorite pasta, setting the plate down in front of me with a forced smile. Another day she bought me a new shirt, saying, "I thought this color would look good on you." But everything felt off, calculated, transactional-like. She was checking boxes instead of offering love. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't trying to comfort me, she was trying to stop me from slipping away. And the truth was, she could feel it happening. I started noticing her frustration grow. She'd sigh when I gave one-word answers. She'd slam cabinet doors a little harder. One night, she muttered under her breath, "I don't know what more you want from me." The irony stung. What I had wanted from her all along was so simple. Compassion, a hand on my shoulder, a moment of being seen. Not gifts, not forced small talk, just genuine presence. But she couldn't give it, because it had never been who she was. And the more she tried to buy back normalcy, the more obvious it became that our connection was gone. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me, like she was studying my face, looking for the man she used to control so icily. But the more she stared, the more I realized she wasn't seeing me anymore. She was seeing her grip slipping, her control fading, and the gap between us widening into something she couldn't fix. And that terrified her. More than my silence ever could. The silence dragged on until one night it finally cracked. We were sitting at the dinner table, the same heavy quiet between us, when she suddenly dropped her fork and snapped. "Why are you treating me like a stranger?" Her voice was sharp, almost panicked, like she couldn't stand the emptiness anymore. I looked up slowly, my hands clenched in my lap. For weeks, I had avoided eye contact, but this time I let her see the anger, the grief, the betrayal sitting behind my eyes. My voice came out low, steady, but heavier than any scream. "Because when I needed you most, you treated me like nothing." Her face shifted instantly, shock, denial, then something like fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. For once, she didn't have a dismissive remark, no sarcastic laugh, no cold lecture about being dramatic. The truth hung in the air between us, undeniable, unshakable. I didn't mean, but I cut her off with a look. For the first time, I wasn't the one scrambling to justify, to soften, to beg for understanding. I was calm, unmovable, and she knew it. The silence that followed wasn't like the ones before. This one carried weight, carried consequence. She shifted in her chair, eyes darting, realizing that my distance wasn't just grief, it was a choice, a boundary, a line she couldn't cross back over. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "I can forgive a lot," I said quietly. But not being abandoned when my mom died, the words hung there. Heavy, final, for the first time in our marriage. She looked at me like she understood that her cruelty had consequences. My silence had been my armor, but now my voice had become the weapon, and it struck harder than anything she expected. After that confrontation, something in her cracked. For days, she hovered around me in a way she never had before. She'd ask if I needed anything, follow me from room to room, and try to spark conversations I had no interest in. Then one evening the dam finally burst. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through my mom's old journal, when she suddenly dropped down beside me, tears spilling down her face. "Please," she whispered, clutching my arm, "don't give up on us. Don't give up on me." Her words tumbled out fast, desperate. She admitted she had been harsh, that she didn't know how to handle emotions, that she panicked when I cried because it made her feel helpless. "I love you," she said between sobs. "I swear I'll change. I can't lose you." For the first time in our marriage, she was the one begging. But as I sat there listening to her choke on promises, I realized something important. Her tears weren't about me. They weren't about my grief or the mother I had lost. They were about her losing control, about her realizing she couldn't dismiss or belittle me into silence anymore. I didn't comfort her. I didn't reach out or wipe her tears. I just sat still, staring at the floor, letting her words hang in the air. Because deep down, I knew she wasn't crying for me, she was crying for herself. And in that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding all along. I didn't owe her forgiveness. I didn't owe her the chance to rewrite what she had already destroyed. Her desperation only made one thing clear. She finally knew I was already gone. The night she begged me to stay was the night I finally felt free. Not because her words touched me, but because I realized they no longer held any power over me. For years, I had bent myself into knots, trying to earn scraps of compassion, trying to convince her that my emotions weren't a weakness. But sitting there, with her tears soaking into the couch cushions, I understood something that should have been clear long ago. I didn't need her to validate my pain. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I didn't slam doors or scream accusations. I moved quietly, calmly, like someone who had already made peace with the choice. She followed me into the hallway, eyes wide, her voice trembling. "Please, don't do this. I'll be better. I'll prove it." I paused long enough to look her in the eye and said, "When my mom died, I needed you. And you weren't there. That's not something I can forget." Her face crumpled, but I didn't stay to watch the rest. I walked out the door with the kind of silence that no longer felt heavy, it felt like freedom. The air outside was cool, the sun barely rising, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling like my chest was caving in. As I drove away, I thought about my mom. I could almost hear her voice, calm and steady, telling me she was proud. Proud that I finally chose myself. Proud that I stopped begging for love that was never going to come. My wife once called me weak for crying, but healing alone, building myself back up from rock bottom, that was strength she would never understand. And this time, I wasn't ashamed of my tears.